At the edge of a quiet graveyard, a wealthy woman visits her son's final resting place, expecting silence, only to find tears that weren't her own. A young black woman, dressed in a simple uniform, stood clutching a baby close to her chest, her eyes red with grief, her body trembling with sorrow. The billionaire froze, her gaze locked on the stranger kneeling before her son's grave, whispering words she could not hear. Why was this woman mourning here, as though she had lost something too? And what secret tied her to the child she held so tightly? The answer would unravel everything the wealthy woman thought she knew. But at that moment, all she could feel was dread. What truth was buried in that grave, waiting to be uncovered?
Eleanor Whitmore was a woman the world respected or envied, draped in wealth, sophistication, and the aura of someone who never needed to fight for her place. She lived behind tall gates and polished marble walls. She was the kind of person others whispered about but never confronted, a billionaire whose power stretched far beyond the city where she was born. Yet for all her money, all her business triumphs, there was one wound that had never healed: the grave of her only son. Every Sunday, without fail, Eleanor visited that quiet patch of earth. Dressed in her immaculate gray suit, pearls gleaming softly at her neck, she would walk between rows of tombstones, each step a mix of ritual and pain. To anyone watching, she seemed untouchable, a woman made of iron, but within her, grief lingered like a shadow. Her son had been the promise of her life, bright, ambitious, the heir to her empire. His death had left a hollow place, one she filled with silence and routine. The graveyard became her sanctuary, a place where she could whisper words no one else would hear. To the world, she was powerful, unshaken, and unyielding. But among the gravestones, she was simply a mother who had lost too much. Across town, life looked very different for Mariah, a young black woman working long hours in a small diner tucked away on the city's edge. She wore her blue uniform and white apron with quiet dignity, even as exhaustion pressed down on her shoulders. Every tip mattered, every shift meant survival, not only for herself, but for the small child she carried in her arms every night after work. Mariah's life was built on sacrifice. She juggled motherhood and labor, rarely pausing for herself. And though her days were heavy, she carried them with strength. Beneath her struggles lived a fierce love for her child, for the future she dreamed might one day be theirs. What no one could see was the thread tying these two women together, their lives unknowingly orbiting the same place of grief and remembrance. Eleanor believed the cemetery belonged only to her sorrow, her memories, her rituals. But soon, she would discover she was not the only one drawn to that grave. The stage was set. One woman armed with wealth and control, the other with resilience and quiet suffering. Their worlds could not have been farther apart, yet fate had already begun to weave them together. And in that weaving lay secrets, painful, unspoken truths that would soon come crashing to light.
The autumn sun cast long shadows across the cemetery as Eleanor made her way to her son's grave, her heels crunching over fallen leaves. It was a ritual she rarely broke, every step measured, every breath carrying the weight of a memory she refused to let fade. But that morning, something was different. From a distance, she noticed movement near the headstone she knew so well. A figure, a stranger. At first, she thought it must be a groundskeeper, someone clearing leaves or tending flowers. But as she stepped closer, her heart stopped. There, kneeling in the damp grass, was a young black woman in a faded blue uniform, clutching a child to her chest. The child was pale, fragile, his small hand tangled in the fabric of his mother's apron. The woman's shoulders trembled with sobs. She wasn't tending to the cemetery, she was mourning. Eleanor froze, her grief colliding with anger. Who was this woman? Why was she at his grave? The headstone bore her son's name, her son's alone. Yet here was a stranger weeping as though the loss was hers. Her voice cracked like glass as she demanded an explanation. But when Mariah lifted her tear-streaked face, Eleanor saw not guilt, but devastation. Eyes red and swollen, she held the baby closer, as though the billionaire's sharp words might shatter the fragile world she had left. Mariah had come quietly that morning, choosing the earliest hour to avoid being seen. For weeks, she had carried the secret in silence, too afraid to confront the possibility of rejection, too burdened to risk humiliation. She had hoped for a few stolen moments by the grave, whispering her truth into the cold earth. But fate had betrayed her. She was no longer alone. The injustice struck quickly. Eleanor's gaze wasn't just one of confusion, it was the piercing, unspoken judgment of a woman who saw only status, color, and boundaries she believed should never be crossed. In her mind, the image was wrong. A black waitress, in her uniform, clinging to a white child at her son's grave. It was more than grief. It was an uninvited intrusion into a space Eleanor thought was hers to guard. The silence thickened, carrying all the weight of centuries of division. Eleanor's chest tightened with disbelief, while Mariah's heart pounded with fear. She could already feel the condemnation pressing down on her like a stone. She was not seen as a grieving woman. She was seen as an intruder. The tension sharpened when Eleanor stepped closer, her words growing colder, her gestures sharper, her voice rising in accusation. Questions spilled out, but beneath them was something more dangerous. The assumption that Mariah didn't belong, that her grief was invalid, that her very presence was an offense. For Mariah, it was a moment that echoed every injustice she had endured in silence. Working endless shifts for pennies, enduring the stares when she carried her son into diners filled with strangers who whispered about the child's light skin, fighting to hold her dignity when customers treated her as invisible. And now, here she was, her pain stripped bare in front of a woman who could not see her as anything more than a trespasser. The baby whimpered in her arms, and Mariah's tears fell faster. She had come for solace, but instead, she stood in the crosshairs of judgment. Every second felt like a trial she had no chance of winning. The injustice was not only in the words Eleanor spoke, but in the silence between them. The unspoken belief that grief belonged to some, but not others. That sorrow was a privilege tied to wealth, to race, to power. That a young black mother could never share in the mourning of a billionaire's son. And yet, Mariah did not leave. Something inside her refused to retreat, even as fear clawed at her chest. She stood rooted in the damp earth, her arms wrapped around her child, her voice trembling as she whispered her truth, not loud enough to be heard, but strong enough to hold her ground. The leaves rustled, a crow cried overhead, and the graveyard seemed to hold its breath. Two women stood locked in a storm of grief and injustice, one unwilling to understand, the other forced to endure. The clash between them was no longer about a grave, but something deeper, something buried far below the surface of what either of them could admit. What neither of them realized was that this confrontation was only the beginning. The truth, the devastating, world-shattering truth, was still waiting to rise from the shadows, and when it did, neither woman's life would ever be the same again.
The cemetery air turned heavy, as though the earth itself was holding its breath. Eleanor's accusations struck like daggers, each one sharper than the last. Her voice trembled with fury, demanding answers that Mariah struggled to form. The baby stirred in her arms, crying softly, his pale face pressing into her chest as though to escape the storm surrounding them. Then it happened. The words Eleanor could not ignore, no matter how desperately she wanted to. Through tears, Mariah whispered the truth. The child she held was not just hers. He was Eleanor's grandson. The world seemed to tilt. The billionaire staggered back, clutching at her pearls as though they could anchor her to reality. Her eyes darted from the child's small features to the tombstone etched with her son's name. The resemblance was undeniable. The same curve of the jaw, the same softness around the eyes. A truth she had been blind to now screamed at her in silence. Shock gave way to rage. Not only had this woman dared to stand at her son's grave, but she carried his legacy in her arms. A legacy Eleanor had been denied, hidden from, left to discover in the most brutal of ways. Her grief twisted into something darker, something poisonous. To her, it was not just betrayal, it was a theft of bloodline, a contamination of her son's name. Mariah trembled, but did not retreat. Every muscle in her body screamed to flee, yet she stayed. Because this moment, this painful, humiliating storm, was also her truth. She was not an intruder. She was family, no matter how violently Eleanor's rejection burned in the air. The graveyard grew colder, silence pressing down like a shroud. Two women, bound by one man's life and death, stood on opposite sides of a truth too heavy to bear. Eleanor's lips parted, but no words came, only the weight of a choice that would alter both of their lives forever. And in that frozen moment, one question lingered like thunder before a storm. Would Eleanor see humanity, or only the color of Mariah's skin?
The silence in the graveyard stretched long, heavier than stone. Eleanor stood frozen, her polished world shattered by a truth she could neither erase nor fully embrace. The child, her grandson, looked up with innocent eyes, carrying within him the legacy of a son she had buried too soon. Yet all Eleanor could see was the reflection of her grief, twisted by prejudice. Mariah, trembling but resolute, turned to leave. She had offered her truth and received only judgment in return. But as her footsteps carried her away from the grave, she held her child tighter, whispering a promise that his worth would never be defined by rejection. Strength replaced sorrow in her chest. She would raise him not in shame, but in love. Love fierce enough to withstand the cruelty of a world that often denied their place within it. Eleanor remained at the grave, consumed by a war within her heart. Part of her yearned to reach out, to hold the child who carried her son's blood. Another part recoiled, chained to the prejudice that had shaped her view of the world. She was left to face the consequence of that choice: loneliness, magnified by the knowledge that family had stood before her, and she had turned it away. The graveyard returned to stillness, but the impact of that day would not fade. For Mariah, it became a symbol of resilience, a reminder that dignity cannot be stolen, even when the world tries to strip it away. For Eleanor, it was a haunting silence she would carry forever, a silence born not just from loss, but from the weight of her own refusal to see humanity where it truly stood. This story is not only about two women and one child. It reflects something far greater: the way racism blinds us, robs us, and builds walls between blood and love. How many families have been broken not by truth, but by prejudice? How many children grow up carrying the burden of rejection they did not deserve? And so the question remains: when we are faced
with love that does not look like us, will we embrace it or let our silence become the loudest injustice of all?